I just got the thumbs. We're going to go ahead and start. Hello. Hi. How was lunch? Was it good? Oh my God, I had the onion dip and it was so good, but it was so loaded with carbs. So I don't know what's going to happen now. I think I got too much carbs and caffeine. It's going to be great. So thank you for coming. And I want to talk to you a little bit about Agile scaling models today. When I was thinking of this talk, I was sharing this over lunch with a few people, and I was like, something happened, somebody said something about Spotify being a scaling model, and then I went on a rant, and I wrote like this long, ranty thing that I was gonna post to Twitter because, you know, that's where you go when you're angry. And my husband was like, maybe don't. And so when Kent and the Des Moines, Iowa team reached out, I was like, oh, I got it. I know where I'm gonna go scream for an hour and people will be actually receptive, maybe, to what I have to say. So this is how the talk came about. Raise your hand if you've heard of snake oil before. It's a pretty common term these days. Yeah. And what I find interesting about the term snake oil is that, you know, we know what the description is, like it's sold as sort of like a cure-all. But there's some interesting origins that I think parallels what's going on with Agile and scaling that I thought I might share with y'all today. So again, why this talk, right? How many of you read like the State of Agile reports that come out every year? Yeah, a few folks. Well, that's where I got these stats. And one of them was that 72% of the latest report respondents practice Scrum or some kind of hybrid of Agile. All right, that's fine. And then it also reported that 30% in the same report use SAFe as their main approach for scaling organizations. And I was like, not so good. And you might be wondering, like, well, what's so bad about that? So what? You know, people need to scale. Organizations want to be more efficient. What could possibly be so bad? Well, I'm going to tell you. So there's a few reasons. First of all, my hypothesis is that we're scaling for all the wrong reasons. Rarely do I go into an organization and the first thing I hear is like, we have a problem. Help us explore this problem. No, what I hear is, we heard that there's a cure-all called Scaled Agile. Help us transform. Sprinkle some Agile on it and we'll all be great. And I think that's really indicative of a problem in the industry that's, I think, well summarized here, which is it's really weird when organizations want to forget how to think and they just want to implement frameworks because they think somebody else has figured it out. I want to shortcut the learning and get to the producing part. Another reason why it's bad is because we've made it needlessly complex. So there's this whole notion of like intentional complexity and unintentional or needless complexity, right? Intentional complexity is stuff is complicated and we will treat it with the respect it deserves. Things like the human brain. That's pretty complex and probably intentionally, I don't know if it's intentionally, but like justifiably complex. My hypothesis is that things like the Scaled Agile framework is somewhat on the needless spectrum. So I found this tweet. Like I said, I was on Twitter like ranting about this a lot, so I found a lot of tweets like supporting my own worldview and my own bubble, and that made me feel good. So I'm gonna share some of those with you. So yeah, when you look at this and you're like, oh my gosh, like they just keep piling things on there. Like, to read their entire diagram takes like a whole weekend nowadays. You're like, wait, what happened to the Agile part? Like, where's the team in this? And that's how I feel about when I, you know, in my experience, when I interact with people who are interested in scaling frameworks. Yeah, and I think we forget that rarely does a complex system start out that way. Even in organic life, right? We started out with, some believe that we started out with single cell organisms and then we grew more complex and here we are today sitting in this room. Same with organizations. You start out small, you learn, you grow, and then you scale. And here it just feels like we start out big and it's become too big to fail and we've introduced something to the system that probably wasn't ready for it. The other reason I think it's bad is because we've fooled ourselves into thinking that these frameworks are the magic pill, and certainly they aren't. And to me, the real danger in doing so is that it stops us from looking for better answers. We think we figured it out. And what happens when you think you figured something out? You stop, call it response, you stop looking. Look, it's after lunch. Y'all gotta help me out here, otherwise we're both gonna fall asleep and it's gonna be super awkward. Okay, so here's a prime example. Do y'all know what this is? Leeches, exactly. So imagine, so in the medieval times, medicine was super interesting, and I have no idea how we survived it. But prior to penicillin, the cure-all at some point in time used to be leeches. You got a headache? Leeches. You broke your foot? Leeches. You're dying? Leeches. And what started to happen is people started to treat leeches as the cure-all, and it wasn't until the 1920s, specifically 1928, when penicillin was invented, that we actually get away from this model. And you're wondering, what does that have to do with this? The point I'm making is, we could have stopped with leeches. Like, we could have all been sitting in this room with some leeches on us if we decided to stop exploring and stop looking for new answers. Get it? Connection made? Yay, okay. So yeah, I just thought Jessica Kerr's quote here truly encapsulated that notion, right? Agile is a framework for learning new things. It's not the end to itself. And that's certainly true for scaling frameworks. So you're like, okay, first of all, who are you? Why are you dressed like a 90s hip hop group? And why are you talking about this in such a ranty way? Hi, I'm Nivia. I've been in tech in many roles, from development, quality, product management, et cetera, for over 17 years. I started practicing XP and Scrum back in 2005. Worked from the trenches, worked on a lot of places. I started to consult in 2014-ish, and then eventually I became a SAFE. I don't even remember what SPC stands for anymore, because I blocked that out of my mental health nowadays, but I was an SAFE SPC for many years, which means I went around and I consulted with organizations. At some point, I was responsible, accountable for transformation at financial organizations and healthcare organizations, and I have about a handful of significant large-scale transformations in my wheelhouse and in my experience, many of them using SAFE SPC. Currently, I'm at my dream job. I'm a department head at Spotify. If you are a free listener to Spotify, thank you. You pay my bills. I'm head of that department, and we have 5 teams under us, and I have the honor of leading the engineering teams and leading the leaders of that department. And yeah, this is my second time at DSM Agile. I came back 2 years ago, and they took 2 years to invite me back. So I guess the feedback was that. Anyway, if you haven't already noticed, this is definitely a biased analysis. But the reason why I think I'm qualified to tell you is a lot of it is from personal experience. So I hope you get some value out of it. So let's step back a little bit and talk about how do we even get here? We know where we are today with scaling models. Many of us know what they are, so I won't necessarily, bore you with those details, but how do we start? Well, to go back to the snake oil analogy, believe it or not, original snake oil was actually effective. It came from it started when in the 1800s, Chinese migrants coming into the United States brought with them home remedies, and they were passed down from families where generations would make this potion that included ingredients made from parts of the Chinese water snake, and they used it for ailments and sores. And obviously it didn't grow back a limb or anything, but it was effective with for minor things. And to me, it parallels how I think Agile started and developed back in the 90s. Anyone remember the 90s? No? Okay, good. Age check. Toyota quality management was quite popular, and I thought, I wouldn't say popular, but was quite emblematic of the values that that Agile embodies today. It was a lot about continuous improvement, a lot about faster feedback cycles. And we also had XP, extreme programming. And that was really focused on making whole teams who felt very accountable for the code that they own. It was called collective code ownership, right? And we had a bunch of people, individuals experimenting, failing, learning. And nowadays we've packaged it up to say things like lean or Kanban. But at the time, early in the movement, it really was about what can we experiment on, what can we learn, and how can we get better faster. So to bring back the analogy, similar to like the original snake oil, you never thought you'd hear snake oil and Agile in the same talk, but here you are. It was, rich in collaboration, rich in feedback. It reduced time to deliver value. And the key link here is that it was small batches. It was small batches with intent and purpose. So, of course, as with everything, what happens when something is successful? Call, response? Copies, right. People are like, well, I want this too. That's natural human behavior, and so we started to see copies of this model. So I don't know if you can read this in detail, but that's sort of like where we got in terms of copies, right? Nowadays, I think this is from the latest report again, nowadays over 30%, as I mentioned, practice SAFe. Some of them practice DAB, less in Spotify model. I love the one that says don't know, like I don't know what I'm doing. I actually respect them more than some of the other ones. So that's sort of like the copies that started to happen. Oh, I want to go back actually. I don't know how to go back physically, but I want to go back. I'll just say it. So what's interesting there is you can find a lot of stats about like how fast Agile is growing and how many people are using it and why they're using it. Try to find a stat about whether or not the organizations are getting the value they intended. You will go down the depths of the internet and not find any information. It's crazy. And I suspect that that's because what's happening is we're cargo culting, we're not exactly seeing the benefits, so we're just like, oh, we're gonna ignore the benefits and we're just gonna focus on the cargo. And I think that's why it's hard to find stats about whether or not people are actually finding the success they were looking for. Okay, so I'm from Spotify, so this is like your requisite Spotify rant. I want to clarify something about the Spotify model. I think you know what's coming. It's not a scaling model, all right? So before I started at Spotify, I was consulting at some massive anonymous conglomerate, and another consulting group came in and they said, we've got it. Like, we're going to do the Spotify model. And I was like, what's that? And they're like, we're going to have tribes and chapters and blah, 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 and whatever we call it. And that was the first time I experienced Spotify as a scaling model before I went there. So then flash forward many years later, and I am sitting in a room in a meeting with Daniel Ek, who's the Spotify CEO, and some of his leadership team, some of the original people who helped it. And one of them goes, funny story about the Spotify scaling model. First of all, we don't know what that is. And second of all, there's this perception that it was some kind of intentional journey, right? Like people sat down and was like, I'm gonna go ahead and create a squad because that's what I need. I'm gonna go ahead and scale it to a tribe. Like that's not how it happened, y'all. How it happened was people were, the company started out with 6 people and it quickly grew to 50 and then multiplied and multiplied. And as that was happening, they were literally trying to keep up with the scale and the amount of subscription and new members they were getting. And people left and right were coming up with ways to do that and then just copying each other. So outside of the walls, there's this notion that there was this like great movement, great migration, or great invention that everyone sort of realized together, and then you had like the scrolls, and here's what we're gonna do. That's not it at all. Sorry, in the front row. Sorry. That's not what happened. It was a very organic growth But then as it started to work and it started to seep out of the roles, and then one of the roles that was invented there, the Agile coach, that got traction, and that's how people just started to find out about it. But it's been so warped and morphed that I think people don't realize that it had much humbler beginnings. So I mentioned Agile coaches, and the thing is, if you're gonna have snake oil, you need a snake oil salesperson. And so what started to happen is you started to see people take advantage of trying to replicate the success they were seeing within different walls, right? So we started to see consultants sort of pitching, I'll call it gently because I was a consultant too, specific models and frameworks to their clients. We started to see the role of Agile coaches being replicated and then becoming certified. We started to see things like PMO and program teams that existed originally, but then started to get like sucked into the scaling models. It just started to become this weird thing, and then certifications just like freaking killed the whole business, in my opinion. And I have 7 certifications, so I could say that. Like right now, this is my picture of a certification. Like this is what it represents. I'm all for certifications, but because when you think about it, it's a quick way to demonstrate your some level of proficiency. Where I get a little bit ranty is the notion that somehow this is now a pedestaled expert that you must listen to, and they have all the answers. I find that the best people in roles that enable Agile are the people who are sort of holding up mirrors to the organization, not the ones who come with all the answers. Does that make sense? Okay, I'm seeing nods, so that's good. So I want to remind us again, like, why is this bad? Again, it's because we think the answer is out there. We think there is an answer, and then all we have to do is replicate that answer. And when we do that, we stop looking and we stop getting better. We are now all leech-wearing folks. Everybody forgot that analogy? Okay. I'm trying to keep you all awake. You got to work with me here. So let's transition a little bit, because I think this entire industry is overdue for a detox, and you're nodding vigorously. So I have 1 convert. I have 2 converts. So that's a good start. I really do think that it's incumbent on all of us to sort of, I hate the word take back because that has a lot of negative connotations, but I can't think of a better word. But I do think it is incumbent on all of us to sort of take it back and bring it back to its roots. And so now this is the part where I tell you how. I kid. I don't have all the answers either. But what I do have are some templates and some things that could be helpful. The first thing I would say is approach software development as you would R&D. Like when I say as you would R&D, does that make sense to folks? What would be some examples of this approach? Shout it out.
You're in a lab.
You're in a lab, right? And what do you do in a lab? You experiment. And when you experiment, what could happen?
You have discovery.
And stuff could also blow up, and you have to also be okay with that, right? So it's super important to realize that not everything will work out. It's even worse than that. Most things won't work out, and that's okay. That's part of the process. The way we do it these days at Spotify, because that continuously evolves, is we have this notion of think it, build it, ship it, tweak it, because it sounds pretty cool. And the idea here is that we spend I know we've sort of demonized planning, and that's somewhat true, but I do say that we spend a lot of time planning, but not necessarily the planning process. What we do is we spend a lot of time planning by trying to fall in love with the problem space. Before we go out and code anything, we really spend time thinking about what are the outcomes we want to drive, so that by the time we get to build it, we all are comfortable that we've experimented enough, and we have a bunch of going experiments that we're building directionally towards the right thing. Does that make sense? And the tweak it part is, like ship it part, you already understand. And the tweak it part is the fact that rarely do we do a full-blown rollout. Oftentimes we stage gate things, we put things behind feature flags, we see what works. And so sometimes we'll spend like a ton of time of like between between ship it, back to think it, because we rolled something out to like 5% of the population and people are like, we hate it. And then we're like, all right, fine. So we spend a lot of time in that experimentation cycle. So it is a type of planning, I would say, but it's a different type of planning. The other thing I would advise is creating a strong experimentation culture. Not only, oh, he's vigorously nodding. I have 3 converts so far in the room. I am killing it. So what I mean by that is, not only are you developing an org structure that is built around experimenting, but you are also building tooling and infra that enables that, right? So examples of that would be things like having a ton of A/B testing. You wouldn't believe how much A/B testing goes on at my organization today. Practically everything is behind the flag so that we're constantly testing. We're testing different markets, different demographics, different layouts, visuals, et cetera, et cetera. But it also includes things like having a tight CI/CD pipeline so we can get things out quickly, right? So we can't put the onus all on the teams to say, well, you have to experiment, but we have no way of enabling that experiment to go anywhere. So again, you start out by operating as if you're in a lab, and then you have the organizational structure to really help you get experiments out quickly from the lab. So this is a model. Have y'all heard of a model called deliberate execution? Raise your hand. No? Okay. One person. Cool. So this is one way we help structure our experiments. As I mentioned, there's a lot of it. And so it's helpful to have some kind of framework to do it. So oftentimes it looks like this. Hey, I have a goal. Maybe the goal is I want to sign up. I want to have 20% growth in teens between, I don't know what teenagers are anymore, between 12 and 18, right? Then we look at, okay, well, what is the data that's out there today? Because oftentimes we're sitting on data that we don't even utilize in our analysis. So before you go find data, like try to understand the information you have today and what does it tell you about what the goal you're trying to accomplish. And then as I mentioned, a lot of the time we spend in our think is this area right here, the problem area. We have a saying in my team that says, fall in love with the problem. Sounds weird, right? Like, who wants to fall in love with a problem? But the truth is, very rarely is it the very first. The problem that you think is the problem. Oh, God, that's poorly stated. It is rarely true. You sort of have to keep digging and uncovering. And only then do you start forming hypotheses. And the trick here is to form as many hypotheses as possible. Think of it, the reason why I had the tree visual in the earlier slide is because I really do want to harp on that point that try to have as many branches of ideas and experiments as possible, because at the end of the day, you don't know which one will be right. So don't put all your eggs in one basket. And then for these hypotheses, for example, hypothesis 3, then you have a set of experiments, right? So you could have a few experiments going, you're out there getting it out in the market, getting out in the field, getting information back, and that's where the learning happens, and then the learning feeds back into the goal, ultimately. Does this make sense to y'all? Okay, cool. The other thing, the other action that I think is super helpful if what you're trying to do is replicate success and you don't necessarily care about a model to do it, is making doing the right things easy. So I have a story for you. Do people use OKR planning? Anyone? Okay, a few of you do. And we use some form of it too in our own way. There were 2 squads, and they both wanted to make changes to a back-end service. Doesn't matter the service for the purposes of this fable. And The changes, though, were almost like contradictory and clashing. And it started to get out of hand, they started to debate. But here's where I think is very unique and hard to replicate unless you already have the ingrained culture. What could have happened next is they could have fought over it, maybe the loudest voice won, or maybe they would have escalated and the person with the most power wins, etc. But they didn't. They literally went back to the OKRs. They really literally went back to those goals and experiments I showed in the previous slide, and they said, what were we trying to do? And which action will get us there faster? So this is what I mean by doing the right things easy. Putting structures in your organization that enables and empowers decision making and tie breaking at the lowest level possible, at the most local level possible, because it's more expensive the higher it goes up the tree, right? Hard to replicate. There's no framework that's going to necessarily tell you to do just that. The other thing that I think is helpful is just removing barriers to communication. So back to my ranting, like, look at this. Like, one of the problems I have with this is like, my interpretation is like that entire middle layer only exists as a communication layer. Like, its sole job is to make sure that this team is talking to this team and then making sure that these teams are following the objectives put in by leadership. Like, there's a whole layer that exists just to communicate. Like, can you imagine what kind of bottleneck nightmare that is? I can, because I've lived it. It's bad. Don't do it. Just make communication easier. So what does that look like, you wonder? All right, disclaimer. Take a picture, fine, but please don't copy. Don't go home and be like, oh, there's a new Spotify motto. Don't do that. So what you're looking at is how we make communication as sort of seamless as possible. We still have squads, and the squads are still focused on autonomy and achieving their direct goal. We also, in some places, have what we call product areas. And that's, again, people with like goals and like outcomes, right? So if you imagine we're all trying to head to one specific direction, it makes sense that all those squads gather together and share their goals, maybe even share their resources. And by resources, I mean tools, not people. And then those product areas come together to form a tribe, because the tribe model is still a good facsimile for people who have big shared missions, right? Still makes sense for that. And then many tribes, which can look very different, some might have product areas, some might just have squads, come together around a central mission. And the way that scales is the mission combined with the business. Y'all remember business partners, right? The mission combined with the business together form the business unit. And that business unit now has all the capabilities, all the tools, all the people it needs to accomplish this big goal we're going after. And then many business units form Spotify. So for example, my business unit is the free business unit, and what we want to do is we want to have like the best free listener out there, like free listener experience out there. And there are many people involved in that, and so we organize ourselves in this way. Does that make sense? Cool. Doing a time check. Cool. I have a lot of time left. So before this talk, as I was setting up, Scott in the third row came up to me, and he was like, oh, I really want to hear what this talk about. You know, I think we have a lot of alignment here. And I was like, yeah, sounds like we're pretty aligned. Maybe you should give the talk, because you're doing a really good job at articulating some of the frustrations I had. And so he made this mention, and I was like, that's exactly it. Like, not even Spotify uses the Spotify model. I really wish I remembered how to go back. Oh, it's backspace. Even in this model, you can see that it looks very different. Every tribe, product area, and to some extent the squad have the power to shape their environment to suit their needs. We don't have this model where you have to have all the same amount of squads. You have to have the same amount of people. You have to follow Scrum. You have to follow none of that. We have loose guidelines, but what we have is a central mission that really drives us off, a central mission that we believe in that really drives all of us forward. And we let that be our guide onto what to do, what's the right thing to do, not how do we follow exactly Scrum, how we follow exactly Kanban, or so on and so forth. Not saying that we don't, but saying that that kind of decision making is not the secret sauce, and that's not what you should be scaling. What you should be scaling is how do we make decisions faster? How do we learn faster? Those are the things to scale. I'm so happy I found that there was just a back button. See, this is what happens when I had a 3 a.m. flight and my brain is not working completely, so I forget little things like the back button helps you like go back on your slides. Anyway, back to my point. My point was we still value autonomy. You wouldn't believe the kind of power squads have and the types of decisions that they can make. But this model with the product areas and the tribes allows us to align because a squad alone can't achieve this big thing that we're trying to do, right? So we tighten up the alignment. We still value speed. Oh my God, we value speed, maybe sometimes too much. But now we realize that the fastest team doesn't get the rest of the organization where it needs to go, so now we value synchronization as well. Have you all ever heard that saying, like, you can, if you want to go fast, you can go alone, but if you want to go big, you need to go together? I'm butchering it, but something like that. Somebody was like, yeah, that's what I'm trying to say there. We still value learning. So if y'all remember, there were things like, oh, we have chapters, and that's how we make sure like her learning happens across the organization. Still value that. Call it a chapter if you'd like, great. We don't always call it that. But now what we try to do is we try to enhance the context in which you learn. Learning everything all at once is awful because first of all, you won't retain most of it anyway. So we try to optimize the org to learn just the things it needs to learn and to give it ways to reach out to others when it's time to learn something new. Don't copy this. Mostly because even if you copy it, it won't work because you have to do your own learning, right? That's the point here. Like if you came here because you thought I'd maybe give you some new tips, the only tip is don't copy this and focus more on learning as what to scale. So I want to summarize a little bit and then leave the door open for questions. Scaling frameworks, the reason why I get ragey over it is because it shortcuts learning. And learning, so the only consistent competitive advantage any organization will ever have is its speed to learning. Y'all heard of the OODA loop? Okay, huh? The OODA loop. Some of y'all might need to help me. Observe, orient, decide, act, OODA loop. And the idea here is that it was developed by Navy pilots. No, not Navy pilots, because that's not a thing, I don't think. But like pilots, jet pilots who were in battle. And consistently, there were some pockets of those pilots, fighter pilots, who used to consistently like outgun, outperform their competitors, their counterparts when they were training. And someone decided to ask them, like, why? How do you do that? Let me replicate it. And the way they've sort of summarized how that happens is the notion of the OODA loop. First, you observe your surroundings. You orient yourself, like, okay, I think this is where I want to be. You make a decision, and you act. And the secret sauce is doing that as quickly and as many times as possible will consistently have you outperform any situation in which you're in. So instead, what I propose is instead of focusing on these scaling frameworks, what you focus on is approaching problems scientifically. Think of yourself as labs, and labs will sometimes fail. Things will sometimes blow up, and that's okay. I promised I wouldn't curse. That's why I had to because we're recording, and my mom might see this, and I want her to be proud and not hear me say all the words I usually say. Accelerate experimentation. Think about, using things like deliberate execution. Think about, use it or don't use it, but the idea is find ways to accelerate your experimentation and experiment as much as possible. Get a ton of things out there. Don't put your eggs in one or two baskets. So use A/B tests, use feature flags, whatever you need to do. Have a ton of experiments going and make sure that they're tied back to these hypotheses so that you can have a frame of reference to measure your experiments by. Optimize your organization for doing the right thing. Don't have it so that people have to solve, no, I do want them to solve problems at the local level. Don't delegate conflict and problems downward. Find ways that people can make natural decisions organically without having to escalate. So whether that means making sure that they have all the context they need to tie break, whether that means making sure that they don't have competing goals, make sure that your organization is set up for that. And then again, remove communication and decision barriers. Have people, literally you can talk to your teams and talk to them about who are the people you need to interact with the most, and how might we shape the organization to reflect that. Don't be afraid to do that, and don't be afraid to adapt and experiment to find what works. Yeah, that's pretty much it for me. I wanted to thank you again. That was supposed to be a gift, but it's, I don't know. It was a waving bear. Wanted to thank you again for your time, for listening to me rant. We're going to clap now and then do Q&A. Please clap.